Welcome to another episode of the Digital Disruptions Dialogues podcast, the podcast where we explore bold ideas, leadership truths, and the human side of innovation. In this episode, we're diving into justice and leadership, what it means to lead with fairness, build trust, and create a culture where everyone can thrive. Speaking on the topic today, I have our president and CEO, Chris Beckford. So let's get into it. Welcome back, Chris. It's good to have you here speaking on this topic today. So first, I wanted to ask, what inspired you to have this conversation on the podcast, and what do you hope leaders or others take away from this?
I think it's important for justice to be clearly understood by both leaders and their employees or subordinates. And because there may be a misunderstanding, because I've heard employees said, well, this isn't fair, but sometimes they're not looking at things from the employer, the leader, the supervisor, the manager's perspective, because life isn't fair. However, we all try to be just. And that's why I think justice as a leadership trait should be discussed.
So justice can mean different things to different people. How do you define justice in the context of leadership?
I see justice as the consistent application of fairness, integrity, impartiality in decision making, and also interpersonal relationships, interactions, and the application of just trying to do ethical business or just being a ethical person trying to do business.
Would you consider justice being one of the most critical leadership traits? And if so, why is that?
Yes, I do. I think it's one of the most important ones. It's kind of interesting because justice is also one of those leadership trait that the Marine Corps pound into your head as a leader. Why is it so important? Because you have to be ethical in the way that you do business, and also just the way that you act or interact with others. And I think that's probably one of the most important things or leadership traits that exist.
Awesome. And can you give an example where applying justice fairly had a direct impact on your team or company culture?
As a business owner, you have options, and you have options on how you, um, for example, reimburse employees, how you compensate. Rule number one, you're in business to make money. However, that doesn't mean that because you're in business to make money, you basically don't um, uh, uh, treat your employees fairly or as fair as possible. And I think that application of justice, just fair treatment, I think is good. Not everybody's going to be treated the same. Not everybody's going to receive the same increase in compensation. There are people that um, deserve, based on their contributions, more than others. Or and I think that's one of the key applications of justice as a leadership trait. Those that work hard should be rewarded.
And you often mention the message to Garcia. I know that you use that often in our company culture. But what lessons does this story teach us about leadership and personal responsibility?
It tells a story about a message, a task being assigned, and that person had to deliver this message. And they took the task, that individual owned the task, they figure out the logistics, And then they accomplished the mission. They delivered the message. And I think from a leadership perspective, too often um, we have people are assigned a task and they want to ask 100 questions about the task when sometimes the most powerful information is in your hands, whether it's your mobile device, your computers, um, and with the answers that you need. But yet, um, sometimes people want to go back to the leader and, okay, can you tell me this? Where is, for example, the message to Garcia? Where is Garcia? How do I find him? What is the best route to take? Um, those questions in many cases are unnecessary. Deliver the message to Garcia. That means take the message, figure out the logistics, come up with a plan, and then execute the plan. I can understand that there may be questions, but they should be few, not overwhelming, where next thing you know, it's better off if the person that's assigning the task perform the task themselves. Because, and if that's the case, then, justify your existence.
And how do you decide when to coach someone versus when to move on and kind of bring in someone new?
That's a very interesting question because it actually comes down to a few things. One of them, probably more important than all others, is um, what is the ROI? Um, and if you can build somebody up, then you should. If you've attempted on multiple occasions to build somebody up, then maybe you don't want to sink too much time into that person because then what else are you sacrificing? Um, it's Pareto's rules, the 80-20 rule. Um, I'd like to focus on the 80%, but if I'm spending all my time on the 20%, then I sacrifice the 80%, which may sacrifice other things. So when do you make that decision? It's different for each person. But you, after trying, and if it's not sticking, if it's not working, then you're going to have to move on because you can't dwell on trying to improve people. Sometimes people just have to take ownership and improve themselves. Um, and sometimes they just have to figure it out. You just can't handhold everybody.
And from that, what role does accountability play in building a just and trusted team environment?
Each person is responsible for their action. Each person is responsible for um, their performance. So first off, you have to take accountability. Now, after you take accountability, uh, and in this case, um, you, there's a level of transparency, equitable treatment, um, impartiality, um, and those are all aspects of um, justice. And if the person is willing to take accountability for their actions, sometimes they will make mistakes. But I think those mistakes in many cases will be or can be forgiven, providing the purpose of the action. For example, if the purpose of the action is to improve the company, to take care of our clients, to increase performance, and all those tasks are being completed without the purpose being selfishness, then if the mistake is made, it can be easily forgiven. But if the mistake is made and the action was for selfish reason, then it's almost unforgiven because, and maybe that's not the right person to have in a company. And that's a very quick application of justice. intent means a lot.
And how do you create an environment where diverse perspectives are welcomed and acted upon?
I think you have to be as transparent as possible. Um, and uh, what does that mean? And foster an environment that enables communication. However, um, by fostering and enabling communication and collaboration, I think everybody still has to understand we may discuss what needs to happen and we may analyze it, we may murder board it, we may shred it. Um, but when the decision's made, the decision's made. There's no time to debate after the decision is made because at some point we have to move forward.
And staying on the topic of diversity, in what ways can unconscious bias show up in leadership decisions, and how can leaders train themselves to avoid it?
And that's one of the very important factors of justice to enable diversity and inclusion. And that diversity and inclusion is from the perspective of enabling the workforce to be successful. That is diversity and inclusion of ideas, thoughts, opinions. That must be encouraged because sometimes uh, the feedback that's obtained from individuals with various perspective is extremely powerful, and it should always be um, when it's time to execute to consider the options that are available and sometimes the ideas from diverse perspectives.
How do you ensure consistency when applying rules and expectations across a diverse team?
We have to use that at some point. Everything has to be based on some level of standards or protocols. And I think once we have those standards in place and we have goals or objectives in place, then we have to consistently apply the rules. And I think uh, that's the best way to enable uh, fairness and uh, make sure that from a leadership perspective, justice is done.
Awesome. And how do you actively shape a positive culture in your organization?
The first start is, who do you hire? The type of people that you hire. And sometimes the person that you hire may not necessarily uh, be the right person because you can't be perfect all the time. But
Mhm.
you want to prioritize ethical conduct, those that believe or reflect equality, consider the well-being of their teammates, and uh, then are transparent, open, and are willing to communicate effectively. And sometimes there may be conflict, and conflict sometimes is a very good thing because it keeps everybody on their toes. Uh, and if everybody follows the same rules and everybody conclude with the same opinion, that's not good for any culture. You need a level of conflict. And at the end of the conflict, the answer will be in the middle someplace.
What does a high morale team look and feel like to you, and how does leadership directly influence that?
A high morale team um, could be a high performing team. And from a leadership perspective, it's almost that all they want and all they need is the plan. What is the intent? What is the objective? And then from there, they'll self organize, almost like a scrum. And when they self-organize, they will decide who will lead, who will lead specific tasks, and develop a plan to execute and deliver on the objective. And they can do all that with just the intent and or the plan provided to them, or a brief summary of what the objectives are, and they will do all the work that's necessary. That, I think, is high performing, and um, probably one of the best teams that uh, that as a CEO you actually need.
And what does empowerment look like at your organization, and how is it tied to leadership?
I think empowerment is, at least within eTRANSERVICES, providing uh, personnel the resources that they need to be successful, and making sure that they have the ability to make the decisions necessary, um, and they own it. That is, I think, empowerment. If you're willing to step up and own and deliver on whatever task assigned, and the leadership is supportive of your actions, you are empowered. The challenge is not everybody wants to be empowered, because some people just don't want to be in charge. Some people just want to do the day-to-day, do their job, and go home. They don't want to be in charge. They don't want to be in a supervisory position. And as a leader, you have to identify those people. Not that you want to remove them from the organization, but you want to make sure that you use them to the max of their capability, potential, or limits.
And how do you identify those people?
Some of those people will self-identify. In fact, most of them will self-identify. And those are the people that you would put a task out there. For example, I need somebody to lead this effort. And somebody may volunteer and other people's won't. And if nobody volunteered, the job still needs to be done. You task it to somebody, and sometimes they'll come back and say, well, I don't want to be in charge.
Mhm.
And if they wanted to be in charge, then they would have volunteered, because that is another leadership trait, initiative. And if you lack initiative, then you won't volunteer. So sometimes one leadership trait complements another.
Awesome. And before we wrap up, what advice would you give to a new leader trying to establish credibility and fairness within a team they've just inherited?
Understand strengths and weaknesses, along with the opportunities that exist for overall success. Be just and be as fair as you can, because we still have an entire workforce that we have to lead. And sometimes what people want, they can't really get. So being able to say no is a matter of leadership. Sometimes you have to say no, or not at this time.
And that's all the questions that I have for you today, but do you have any last thoughts that you would like to wrap up with?
No, I think leaders that empower uh, justice are more likely to make decisions that align with the ethical standards, the legal standards, and reduce the amount of misconduct that exists within